The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Street as James Wilson carefully signaled and pulled into a parking spot outside the Veterans Support Center. At 72, he moved a bit slower than he once did, but his posture remained straight. A habit from his 30 years in the Air Force that he couldn't shake even if he wanted to. The weekly support group had run longer than usual, with 2 new veterans joining who needed extra time to share their stories. James checked his watch. Almost 6. His wife Patricia would be waiting with dinner. She never complained when the meetings ran long, understanding how important they were to James and the others who gathered to talk through experiences that only fellow service members could truly understand. He eased his blue Buick sedan back onto the road, driving exactly 5 miles under the speed limit as he always did. The streets were quiet in this part of town as the workday ended, just a few cars heading home like him. James turned on the radio to catch the evening news, keeping the volume low as he navigated the familiar route home. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. James frowned, checking his speedometer again. He hadn't been speeding. His turn signals worked fine. The registration and insurance were up to date. He'd just renewed them last month. With the practiced calm that had served him through 2 wars, James signaled and pulled to the curb, positioning his car carefully. He turned off the radio and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible. These were precautions he'd taught his sons and grandchildren. The extra steps that black folks often took during traffic stops to avoid misunderstandings. In the mirror, he watched a young officer step out of the patrol car. The man couldn't be more than 30. With a stiff walk and a hand resting near his holster, James rolled his window down and waited. "License and registration," the officer demanded without introduction, his voice carrying an edge that made James stiffen slightly. "Good evening, officer," James said, his voice measured and respectful. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer, Brady according to his nameplate, narrowed his eyes. "You were weaving across lanes back there. You been drinking today?" James blinked in surprise. He hadn't been weaving at all. "No, sir. I don't drink. I was just coming from the veterans group meeting at the community center." Officer Brady snorted. "Yeah, right. License and registration now." "Of course," James moved slowly, narrating his actions. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket now." He carefully extracted his license, then reached for the glove compartment. "I'm opening the glove box for my registration." As he handed over the documents, a small pin fell from the visor above him. It was his Air Force Colonel insignia, something he kept in the car as a small reminder of his service. Officer Brady picked it up, turning it over with a dismissive look. "Playing dress-up with military pins now, Pops?" The disrespect caught James off guard. In his 30 years of service and 15 years of retirement, he'd encountered prejudice but rarely so open and unprovoked. "That's mine from my service, officer. I was a colonel in the Air Force," Brady laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Sure you were. And I'm the Secretary of Defense." He studied James's license with exaggerated scrutiny. "James Wilson, huh? You're a long way from your side of town." The implication wasn't subtle. This neighborhood was predominantly white, though James had never thought of the town in such divided terms. He'd lived in his home for nearly 20 years, just 3 miles away. "I live on Maple Avenue," James said quietly. "Just a few minutes from here." "Convenient," Brady muttered, clearly not believing him. He handed back the colonel pin with 2 fingers, as if reluctant to touch it too long. "Step out of the car, Mr. Wilson." James felt a flutter of concern. "May I ask why, Officer Brady?" "I haven't broken any laws that I'm aware of." "Out of the car." Each word came out clipped and hard. "Or would you prefer I help you out?" A couple walking their dog on the sidewalk slowed, watching the interaction with worried expressions. James noticed the woman pull out her phone, holding it at her side. James carefully unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, wincing slightly as his arthritic knee protested. At 6'1", he had once been an imposing figure, but age had softened his edges and added a slight stoop to his shoulders. Still, he stood as straight as he could, facing the younger officer with dignity. "Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle," Brady ordered, twirling his finger. "Officer, I'd like to know the reason for this search," James said, his voice firm but not confrontational. Decades of commanding troops had taught him how to question without seeming insubordinate. Brady stepped closer, his face just inches from James's. "Listen here, boy. When I give you an order, you follow it. That's how this works." The slur hung in the air between them, an ugly reminder of attitudes James had hoped were fading from the world his grandchildren would inherit. The couple with the dog had stopped completely now, the woman definitely recording with her phone. Another car slowed as it passed. James slowly turned and placed his hands on the roof of his car. The metal felt cool under his palms. He thought of his grandchildren, of the lessons he tried to teach them about keeping calm in the face of injustice, about how to make it home safely. "Feet back wider," Brady barked, kicking at James's shoes. James complied, spreading his stance. His knee throbbed. Brady began a rough pat-down, checking James's pockets with none of the professional detachment that should accompany such a search. "What are you doing in this neighborhood, really?" he asked, his voice low enough that only James could hear. "Looking for unlocked cars? Open windows?" "I told you, officer. I'm on my way home from a veterans meeting." James kept his voice steady despite the indignity of the situation. "I live 3 miles from here. I have for 20 years. Brady pulled James's wallet from his back pocket again, opening it wide. He removed the military ID card James still carried, studying it with open skepticism. "This some kind of fake ID shop job? They don't make colonels who look like you." He flicked the ID card disrespectfully, nearly dropping it. James felt heat rise in his neck but kept his expression neutral. "I served from 1971 to 2001. 30 years. I retired as a colonel. That ID is authentic, as you can verify." A small crowd had gathered now, the couple with the dog, 2 teenagers on bikes, and a woman who had pulled her car behind the police cruiser. Most had phones out, recording the encounter. James felt a complicated mix of emotions about the audience. On one hand, witnesses could keep things from escalating. On the other, the humiliation of being treated this way in public cut deep. Brady seemed to notice the growing audience, too. He leaned in close to James's ear. "You've got quite a story going, old man. Vietnam vet, Colonel? Next you'll tell me you have a Purple Heart, too." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Silver Star, actually," James said quietly, not as a boast but as simple fact. The medal sat in a frame at home alongside his other commendations. A reminder of the night he'd led a rescue mission that saved 12 of his fellow airmen after their base came under heavy fire. "Right." Brady snorted. "And I'm sure you walked uphill both ways in the snow to get it." He slapped the wallet against James's chest. "Get your fantasy military ID and this junk back in your wallet before you try it on someone who will actually believe you." A woman's voice called out from the small crowd. "Is everything okay over there?" Brady turned, his demeanor instantly shifting. "Just a routine traffic stop, ma'am. Please continue about your business." James carefully tucked his ID and wallet away. He could feel eyes on him, the weight of witnesses to his humiliation. But he'd faced worse. "Much worse. Am I free to go, officer?" he asked. Brady studied him with open contempt. "I should run your plates, see what else comes up. Bet there's more to your story than what you're telling me." "You're welcome to do so," James replied evenly. "My record is clean." Thunder rumbled in the distance and James noticed dark clouds gathering. Patricia would be worried if he was much later. She'd probably already kept his dinner warm and was waiting by the window, perhaps trying his cell phone which he'd left charging at home. Brady seemed to deliberate, enjoying the power he held over the older man's evening. Finally, he stepped back. "I'm giving you a warning this time. For the lane weaving and for the attitude. Next time might not go so easy for you." "There was no lane weaving, Officer Brady," James said, his voice quiet but clear enough for the bystanders to hear. "And I've shown you nothing but respect despite your treatment." Something dangerous flashed in Brady's eyes, but the presence of so many recording devices seemed to give him pause. He thrust a finger toward James's face. "Get back in your car and drive away before I change my mind about that warning." James nodded once, a gesture that conveyed acknowledgement without submission. He carefully opened his car door and lowered himself into the seat, conscious of every pair of eyes watching. As he pulled away from the curb, he could see Officer Brady in his rearview mirror, watching him go with hands on hips as if daring him to make a wrong move. The small crowd of witnesses was dispersing, some looking back at the police car with concerned expressions. James drove exactly at the speed limit, using his turn signal well in advance of each turn. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the only outward sign of the turmoil within. Not until he was 3 blocks away did he allow himself a deep, shaky breath. Patricia would notice something was wrong the moment he walked in. He'd tell her what happened, of course. After 46 years of marriage, they kept no secrets. She'd be upset, might even want to call their son-in-law who worked for the city council. But James wasn't sure yet what he wanted to do about what had just happened. The rain started falling as he turned onto his street. The first heavy drops hit his windshield like tears. What Officer Brady didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to find out before making his judgments, was exactly who James Wilson was in this town. And by tomorrow morning, that ignorance would matter a great deal. Rain pattered against the kitchen window as Patricia Wilson set a plate of food in the microwave. James was late, which wasn't like him. The veterans' meeting sometimes ran over, but he always called when they did. She glanced at the clock again, 6:45 p.m. The worry lines around her eyes deepened. When headlights finally swept across the driveway, Patricia let out a relieved breath. She moved to the front door, watching through the window as James sat in the car for a long moment before getting out. Even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong. 46 years of marriage had taught her to read his body language like a familiar book. James walked slowly to the door, his shoulders hunched against the rain. When he stepped inside, water dripping from his jacket, Patricia immediately took his hand. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. James squeezed her hand but didn't answer right away. He hung up his wet jacket and followed her to the kitchen, where the microwave beeped to announce his reheated dinner. "I got pulled over," he finally said, sitting at the table while Patricia placed the food in front of him. Steam rose from the plate of pot roast and vegetables, but James made no move to eat. "For what?" Patricia sat across from him, reaching for his hand again. "Officer said I was weaving." "I wasn't." James looked up, meeting her eyes. "Young white officer. Name was Brady. Treated me like I was nothing, Pat. Called me boy." Patricia's intake of breath was sharp. At 70, she'd lived through decades of civil rights struggles alongside James. They'd both hoped those days of blatant disrespect were fading, especially in a town where they'd been respected community members for decades. "He made me get out of the car, searched me right there on Pine Street, like I was some kind of criminal." James's voice remained steady, but Patricia could see the hurt and anger in his eyes. "Wouldn't believe I was a veteran. Mocked my Colonel ID." "Oh, James." Patricia's grip on his hand tightened. "Did anyone see this happen?" "Several people. Some were recording on their phones." He finally picked up his fork, though he just moved the food around his plate. One woman asked if everything was okay. Brady told her to mind her business. The kitchen fell silent except for the continued patter of rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder. Patricia watched her husband, seeing not just the dignified 72-year-old man before her, but also the young airman she'd fallen in love with, the major who'd missed the birth of their second child while deployed, the colonel who'd led men and women with unshakable integrity. "We should call Thomas," she said finally. Their son-in-law worked for the city council and had connections throughout the local government. James shook his head. "Not tonight. Let me think about it first. James Wilson," Patricia's voice grew firm. "That officer humiliated you in public. He needs to be held accountable. And he will be," James assured her, finally taking a bite of his dinner. "But I want to handle this the right way." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Patricia answered it, her expression shifting from concern to surprise. "Yes, he's here. He's fine." She looked at James. "It's Diane Cooper. She saw what happened." Diane was their neighbor who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. James took the phone, his voice returning to its usual composed tone. "Hello, Diane. James, I just got home and saw a video online of what happened to you. Are you okay?" "That officer was completely out of line." James closed his eyes briefly. "I'm fine, Diane. Just got home myself." The video is all over the neighborhood Facebook group. People are furious. Mrs. Abernathy already called the police station to complain. So did the Hendersons. James hadn't expected news to spread so quickly. "I appreciate everyone's concern, but I'd like some time to decide how to handle this." "Of course," Diane replied. "But you should know that woman with the dog who was recording. Her husband is a reporter for the local paper." She tagged him in her post. After thanking Diane for her call, James hung up and looked at Patricia. "It's already on social media. The whole neighborhood knows." Patricia nodded, unsurprised in the age of instant information. "What do you want to do?" James finally began eating his dinner in earnest. his appetite returning as he thought through his options. I want to address this properly. Not just for me, but for the next person Officer Brady decides to treat that way. Someone who might not have people recording, who might not have community standing to protect them. You're thinking about the Police Oversight Committee, Patricia said. It wasn't a question. 3 years ago, after a series of concerning incidents, the town had established a civilian oversight committee to review police conduct and recommend policy changes. James had been asked to chair the committee due to his military background and reputation for fairness. The irony that he now found himself a potential complainant wasn't lost on him. I can't chair the meeting if my own case is being discussed, he said. But yes, this needs to go before the committee. The phone rang again. This time it was their daughter Lisa calling from her home across town. Dad, are you okay? Thomas just showed me a video of you being harassed by a cop. Lisa's voice carried the protective fury of a daughter seeing her father mistreated. I'm fine, Lisa. Your mother and I were just discussing it. Thomas is livid. He wants to call the mayor right now. James sighed. Tell Thomas I appreciate his concern, but ask him to hold off. I'll come by tomorrow morning and we can talk about the best approach. After reassuring Lisa and ending the call, James and Patricia moved to the living room. James sank into his armchair, suddenly feeling every one of his 72 years. The rain continued outside, a steady backdrop to their conversation as they discussed options late into the evening. By the time they went to bed, James's phone had 14 voicemails and 32 text messages from friends, former colleagues, and neighbors. The local community, which included current and retired judges, business owners, and civic leaders, was rallying behind one of their most respected members. Sleep didn't come easily for James that night. He kept replaying the traffic stop in his mind, the casual cruelty of Officer Brady's words, the assumption that he didn't belong in his own neighborhood. It wasn't the first time he'd faced prejudice, of course. He'd encountered it throughout his military career, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. But he'd thought things were changing. He'd hoped for better for his grandchildren. Around 2 a.m., he carefully got out of bed, trying not to wake Patricia, though he suspected she was only pretending to sleep. In his study, he turned on the small desk lamp and opened his laptop. The neighborhood Facebook group was still active despite the late hour, with dozens of comments about the incident. Several people had shared the videos, which had been viewed thousands of times already. James watched one of the recordings, seeing himself through a stranger's phone camera, an elderly man standing with his hands on his car while a young officer searched him roughly. The indignity of it struck him anew, but something else caught his attention too. The growing crowd of witnesses, the concerned faces, the people clearly troubled by what they were seeing. He closed the laptop and went to the window looking out at the rain-slicked street. The town he'd called home for 20 years had changed in many ways, but tonight had shown him that while some things remained painfully the same, other things had indeed improved. People had witnessed an injustice and hadn't turned away. They'd recorded it, spoken up, reached out to check on him. That at least was progress. Morning came with clearing skies and a fresh resolve. James dressed with particular care, choosing a crisp blue shirt and his good gray slacks. When Patricia saw him come downstairs in what she called his meeting clothes, she nodded in understanding. I'm going to the station, he told her over breakfast. Then to see Thomas and Lisa. Patricia squeezed his arm. What changed your mind about waiting? I keep thinking about what might have happened if I'd been someone else. Someone without videos being taken, without community connections. James buttered his toast methodically. This needs to be addressed today before Officer Brady interacts with anyone else. As James finished his coffee, the doorbell rang. Patricia went to answer it, returning with a grim expression. It's Chief Reynolds. Police Chief Michael Reynolds stood in their entryway, cap in hand. The lines on his face suggested a man who hadn't slept much either. Colonel Wilson, he said, extending his hand. I think we need to talk about what happened yesterday. James nodded, gesturing toward the living room. I was planning to come see you this morning anyway, Chief. Chief Reynolds looked relieved but still troubled. The videos are everywhere, Colonel. I've already placed Officer Brady on administrative leave pending an investigation. Good, James said simply, sitting across from the police chief. But this isn't just about one officer. It's about training, about culture, about who you hire and how you supervise them. The chief nodded, clearly anticipating a difficult conversation. I understand, sir. And I want you to know, everyone at the department is horrified by what happened to you. James leaned forward slightly. Not what happened to me, Chief, what Officer Brady did. There's a difference. He paused, gathering his thoughts. And I'll be bringing this before the Oversight Committee, not as its chair, but as a citizen filing a formal complaint. Chief Reynolds swallowed hard. Of course. That's your right. Now, James continued, his voice taking on the calm authority that had served him well through decades of military leadership. Tell me what you know about Officer Brady, and let's discuss what happens next. What neither man yet realized was just how far the videos had spread overnight, or that James's son, a lieutenant colonel currently stationed overseas, had already been forwarded the footage by concerned friends back home. By noon, the story would reach the state attorney general's office where James's niece worked as chief of staff. By evening, it would make regional news. Officer Brady, arriving home after being placed on leave, had no idea that his treatment of an elderly black veteran was about to become the catalyst for long overdue changes in the department, or that the old man he had humiliated was connected to some of the most influential people in the state. He would learn soon enough. Officer Ryan Brady stared at his ceiling fan, watching it spin in lazy circles above his bed. Sleep had been impossible after Chief Reynolds had called him at 6 a.m., ordering him to the station immediately. The chief's voice had been cold, clipped, nothing like his usually friendly tone. The meeting that followed still played on repeat in Brady's mind. The conference room, the laptop open to show the videos, Chief Reynolds and Captain Torres sitting across from him, their faces like stone. Do you recognize this man, Brady? The chief had asked, pointing to the screen where an elderly black man stood with his hands on a car roof. Brady had nodded, trying to look appropriately serious while downplaying the incident in his mind. Just another traffic stop. Maybe he'd been a little rough, but nothing worth this level of concern. That's James Wilson, Captain Torres had said when Brady didn't offer any elaboration. Colonel James Wilson, 30 years in the Air Force, Vietnam and Gulf War veteran, Silver Star recipient. Brady had felt the first flutter of unease. A colonel? But he'd pushed back. His ID looked fake to me, sir. And he was weaving. The dash cam shows no weaving, Brady. Chief Reynolds cut in. Not even close. And that military ID? It's registered in our system. You could have verified it with a simple check. Brady had shifted in his chair, the unease growing. Well, I didn't know who he was. And he was in an area where what? Chief Reynolds leaned forward. Where a black man doesn't belong. Colonel Wilson has lived in this town for 20 years. 3 miles from where you pulled him over. The chief had tapped his finger on the table, each tap like a hammer driving Brady deeper into his seat. But there's more you should know about Colonel Wilson. Brady? He chairs the police oversight committee that was established 3 years ago. The chief's voice had been dangerously quiet. The same committee that will now review your conduct. Brady had felt the blood drain from his face. Still more, Captain Torres had added. His son-in-law is Thomas Henderson, city council member. His son is Lieutenant Colonel Wilson, currently stationed in Germany. And his niece? Torres had paused for effect. She's chief of staff to the state attorney general. The ceiling fan kept spinning above Brady now, hours later, as the full weight of his actions settled on his chest like a stone. The chief had placed him on administrative leave pending an investigation. His gun and badge sat in a lockbox across the room, making him feel strangely naked, vulnerable. His phone buzzed again, the 15th notification in the last hour. Brady picked it up reluctantly. It was a text from his mother. Ryan, are you the officer in this video? Please call me. Attached was a link to a news article. Decorated veteran racially profiled by local police officer. Brady threw the phone down and covered his face with his hands. The story had gone beyond local social media. It was in the news now. His name wasn't in the article yet, but it would be soon enough. He thought about calling his police union rep, but shame kept him from reaching for the phone. What would he say? That he'd profiled an elderly man because of his race? That he'd mocked a decorated veteran's service to his country? That he'd used a racial slur that had been caught clearly on video? The fan kept spinning around and around as Officer Brady's world collapsed beneath him. Across town, James Wilson sat at his daughter's dining room table, surrounded by family. Lisa poured coffee while her husband Thomas paced the length of the room, phone pressed to his ear. Their teenage children, David and Angela, sat quietly, watching their grandfather with worried eyes. "The mayor wants to meet with you today," Thomas announced, ending his call. "She's furious about what happened." James nodded, unsurprised. Mayor Howard had appointed him to the Oversight Committee personally, and had been a friend for years. "I've already gotten calls from 3 news stations and the Tribune," Lisa added. "They all want statements." "No press," James said firmly. "Not yet. Dad, people need to hear about this," Lisa protested. "What that officer did will be addressed through proper channels," James finished. He looked at his grandchildren, noting how intently they were following the conversation. This was their education too, he realized. How to respond to injustice with dignity and purpose rather than just anger. "I'm meeting with the Oversight Committee this afternoon," he explained. "As a complainant, not as chair. Vice Chair Rodriguez will run the meeting." Thomas finally sat down, still visibly agitated. "Your face is all over the internet, James. People are outraged. They want this officer fired." James sipped his coffee thoughtfully. And what would that accomplish besides satisfying people's anger? "Justice," Thomas said emphatically. "One officer losing his job isn't justice. It's a consequence for him, certainly, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem." James set his cup down carefully. "I'm more interested in lasting change than a quick firing to appease public outrage." Lisa reached over to squeeze her father's hand. "What kind of change are you thinking about, Dad?" Before James could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Calder Wilson, his son calling from Germany. "Michael," James answered warmly. "You've heard, I take it." "Dad!" His son's voice came through clearly despite the distance. "Are you all right?" "I saw the videos. I've already requested emergency leave to come home." "I'm fine, son. And there's no need for emergency leave. I'm handling it." "The way that officer treated you," Michael's voice broke slightly. "If I'd been there, but you weren't," James said gently. "And that's good, because now we can address this the right way, not in the heat of the moment." The conversation with his son continued for several minutes, with James providing reassurance and his children adding details about the growing community response. By the time he hung up, James had a clearer vision of how he wanted to proceed. "I don't want Officer Brady fired," he announced to his surprised family. "I want him educated. I want the department reformed. I want lasting change that will protect the next person he pulls over." Thomas opened his mouth to object, but James raised a hand. "Hear me out. This young officer acted from ignorance and prejudice. Firing him just sends those attitudes elsewhere. But if we can change how this department operates, the training, the accountability, the community engagement, we make things better for everyone." James stood, straightening to his full height, suddenly looking more like the colonel he had been than the grandfather he now was. "I've spent my life in service. I'm not about to stop now." The police station buzzed with unusual activity for a weekday morning. News vans parked along the street outside. Inside, officers spoke in hushed tones, glancing frequently toward the chief's office where the blinds remained firmly closed. In that office, Chief Reynolds massaged his temples, fighting a growing headache. On his desk lay personnel files, training records, and department policies, all under scrutiny now because of one officer's actions. A knock at his door preceded Captain Torres, who entered with a tablet in hand. "It's gone national, Chief. CNN just picked it up." Reynolds groaned. "Of course they did. What's the angle?" "Decorated black veteran, Silver Star recipient, humiliated by white officer. Civil rights leaders are already weighing in. And Brady?" Torres shook his head. "He's at home. I've assigned Rodriguez to keep an eye on his place in case reporters show up." Reynolds nodded his approval. However Brady had behaved, officer safety was still a priority. "The Oversight Committee meeting is set for 3 p.m. Torres continued. "Colonel Wilson will be there to present his complaint." "I'll be there too," Reynolds said. He picked up one of the files from his desk. Officer Brady's training record. "Did you know Brady failed the cultural sensitivity training last year? He was supposed to repeat the course, but never did." "Someone signed off on it anyway." Torres frowned. "I didn't know that." "Who signed off?" "Lieutenant Parker," Reynolds said grimly, "who coincidentally is Brady's uncle by marriage." "Jesus," Torres muttered. "This keeps getting worse." Reynolds closed the file with a decisive snap. "No, Captain. This is when it starts getting better. We needed to know these things were happening in our department. Now we do. The oversight committee room was packed by 2:45 p.m. All 9 committee members were present, along with Chief Reynolds, the mayor, 3 city council members including Thomas, and several community representatives. James sat in the audience section rather than his usual chair, waiting quietly as Vice Chair Rodriguez called the meeting to order. "We have an unusual situation today," Rodriguez began. "Our chairman, Colonel Wilson, is here as a complainant. Colonel, whenever you're ready." James walked to the podium, aware of all eyes on him. He'd faced tougher audiences, hostile fire in Vietnam, Pentagon brass during budget cuts, but this felt weightier somehow, more personal. "Yesterday evening I was pulled over by Officer Ryan Brady," he began, his voice steady. What followed was a textbook example of racial profiling and unprofessional conduct. For the next 10 minutes, James detailed the encounter dispassionately, as if reporting military intelligence rather than a personal humiliation. He noted Officer Brady's language, his assumptions, his escalating hostility, all without emotion coloring his account. "I'm not here seeking Officer Brady's termination," James concluded, surprising many in the room. "I'm here because our police department needs structural change. Better training, yes, but also better supervision, community engagement, and accountability." He looked directly at Chief Reynolds. "The officer who pulled me over yesterday didn't know who I was. But the greater failure is that he didn't try to find out. He saw only what he expected to see, what his prejudice allowed him to see. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what needs to change." A heavy silence fell over the room when James finished speaking. Mayor Howard was the first to respond, her voice thick with emotion. "Colonel Wilson, on behalf of the city, I want to apologize for how you were treated. I assure you, action will be taken." Chief Reynolds stood next. "Colonel, I've spent the day reviewing Officer Brady's record and our departmental procedures. I've found failures at multiple levels, not just with the officer himself. I take full responsibility for those failures, and I pledge to work with this committee to address them." One by one, committee members spoke, offering suggestions, asking questions, proposing changes. The meeting that had been scheduled for an hour stretched to 3 as a comprehensive plan began to take shape. Throughout it all, James listened intently, occasionally offering input but mostly watching democracy at work, messy, imperfect, but moving toward justice in its own way. As the meeting finally adjourned, James found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. But his mind was elsewhere, thinking of a young officer sitting alone at home, unaware that his worst professional mistake might ultimately make him a better police officer, if he was willing to learn. That remained to be seen. And James Wilson, who had spent a lifetime teaching young men and women in uniform, found himself hoping that Officer Brady would prove teachable after all. 2 weeks had passed since the traffic stop that changed everything. The media storm had intensified before gradually fading into the background of national news, though locally, the story remained very much alive. Officer Ryan Brady sat alone in the small apartment he'd barely left since being placed on administrative leave. Empty takeout containers littered the coffee table, and unwashed clothes spilled from the hamper in the corner. The blinds stayed drawn, keeping the world at bay while he wrestled with the consequences of his actions. His phone buzzed with a text message. His mother again. "The letter from the department came today. Call me when you're ready to talk." Brady tossed the phone aside and ran his hands through his unwashed hair. The decision was coming. He knew what it would likely be, termination. Part of him wanted to fight it, to argue that one mistake shouldn't end his career. Another part, the part that had been forced to watch those videos over and over during the internal investigation, knew he deserved whatever was coming. The knock on his door startled him. Brady froze, wondering if it was another reporter. They'd mostly given up after the first week. But occasionally one still tried for an exclusive with the racist cop, as online comments had labeled him. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Officer Brady," a male voice called. "It's Chief Reynolds. I know you're in there. We need to talk." Brady considered pretending he wasn't home but then sighed and moved to the door. He was still in the sweatpants and t-shirt he'd slept in, but he no longer cared about appearances. Chief Reynolds stood in the hallway, uniform crisp and face unreadable. He held a large envelope in one hand. "May I come in?" he asked, glancing past Brady at the disheveled apartment. Brady stepped aside wordlessly, then scrambled to clear space on the couch. "Don't bother," Reynolds said, remaining standing. This won't take long. Here it comes, Brady thought. The official termination. The Oversight Committee completed their review yesterday, Reynolds began, his voice professionally neutral. They've made their recommendations to the department, and I've made my decision. Brady nodded, bracing himself. You're being suspended without pay for 30 days, Reynolds continued. After which, you'll be placed on 6 months probation with weekly reviews. Brady's head snapped up in surprise. I'm not fired? That was my initial inclination, Reynolds admitted. But someone advocated for a different approach. Who? Reynolds fixed him with a hard stare. Colonel Wilson. Brady felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. The man I pulled over? But why would he? That's what I asked him, Reynolds said, his tone softening slightly. He said termination doesn't solve problems. It just moves them elsewhere. The chief paused. He also said young officers can learn if given the right guidance. Brady sank onto the arm of his sofa, struggling to process this information. After everything he'd said, everything he'd done to humiliate the older man, Colonel Wilson had advocated for him to keep his job? Reynolds handed over the envelope. This contains the terms of your suspension and probation. It also includes the required training you'll need to complete before returning to duty. Brady took the envelope with unsteady hands and opened it. The first page outlined the suspension terms, standard department language. The second page, however, made his eyebrows rise. 200 hours of community service? At the Veterans Center? He looked up at the chief in disbelief. Reynolds nodded. Colonel Wilson's suggestion. He volunteers there 3 days a week. You'll be working alongside him, but that's... Brady stopped, unable to find the words. Uncomfortable? Humbling? Yes, I imagine it will be. Reynolds didn't sound particularly sympathetic. You'll also be required to complete cultural sensitivity training, implicit bias recognition, and de-escalation techniques. Actual completion this time, not just a sign-off. The chief moved toward the door, then paused. The Oversight Committee is implementing department-wide changes because of this incident. New training requirements, community engagement protocols, body cam reviews. Your actions affected more than just your own career, Brady. After the chief left, Brady sat for a long time with the papers in his hand, reading and rereading the terms. Not fired. Given another chance he wasn't sure he deserved. And by the very man he had treated with such contempt. Shame washed over him anew, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a flicker of determination. If Colonel Wilson believed he could change, maybe he could prove the man right. Brady stood up and looked around his apartment with fresh eyes. The mess reflected the chaos of the past 2 weeks, the spiral he'd allowed himself to fall into. He moved to the window and raised the blinds, letting in the afternoon sunlight for the first time in days. Then he picked up his phone and called his mother. It was time to face what came next. The Veterans Center bustled with activity as James Wilson guided a group of young service members through their transition paperwork. At 72, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his mind remained sharp, particularly when it came to navigating the labyrinth of veterans' benefits. Make sure you keep copies of everything,
he advised a young woman recently returned from overseas deployment.
The VA is improving, but paperwork still has a way of disappearing. She nodded gratefully, adding her discharge papers to the growing file. My dad warned me about the red tape. Said it was worse than combat sometimes, James smiled. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, she said quietly. Vietnam. Agent Orange got him 5 years ago. James placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, no words needed between them. The understanding that passed between veterans of different eras required no explanation. The center's director, Alan Phillips, approached with an awkward expression that immediately caught James's attention. Colonel, do you have a moment? Phillips gestured toward his office. Inside the small office, Phillips closed the door and sighed. Officer Brady starts his community service tomorrow. I've assigned him to the front desk, but I can change that if you'd prefer not to interact with him. James shook his head. No need for that, Alan. The point is for him to interact with veterans, to see us as people rather than stereotypes. That includes me. You're a better man than most, Phillips said, shaking his head in admiration. Not sure I could be so forgiving if I'd been treated that way. It's not about forgiveness, James replied. It's about change. That young officer has a choice to make about who he's going to be for the rest of his career. I'd like to help him make the right one, Phillips nodded thoughtfully. Well, the other volunteers have been briefed. They know he's coming as part of disciplinary action, though most have probably seen the videos by now anyway. Ask them to treat him normally, James requested. No cold shoulders, no extra kindness. Just normal. He needs to see how we treat each other here. After finishing with his group, James drove home, mulling over the coming days. Patricia was waiting on the porch, enjoying the mild spring evening. She stood as he approached, studying his expression with the insight of decades together. You're worried about tomorrow, she stated, taking his hand as they settled into the porch swing. Not worried exactly, James corrected, just thinking about how to approach it. Patricia squeezed his fingers. You'll find the right way. You always do, she paused. Are you sure about this, though? You don't have to be the one to teach this young man. Who better? James asked simply. He made assumptions about me based on my age and my race. The best way to challenge those assumptions is to let him get to know me, and others like me. They sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them. From inside came the sound of their grandson playing piano. He was staying with them for the week while Lisa and Thomas took a much-needed vacation. I keep thinking about my father, James said finally. How many times he had to swallow his pride, bite his tongue. The difference is, back then there were no cell phones recording, no oversight committees, no accountability. Patricia nodded. James's father had worked as a mechanic in rural Georgia during the height of the civil rights movement, facing daily indignities with the stoic resolve that he later passed to his son. He would be proud of how you've handled this, she said, though he might not understand why you're giving that officer a second chance. James smiled slightly. I'm not sure I fully understand it myself. I just know it feels right. As night fell, James found himself both dreading and looking forward to the coming day. There would be awkwardness, certainly. Possibly tension, but also the potential for growth, not just for Officer Brady, but perhaps for everyone involved. The Veterans Center was unusually quiet the next morning when Officer Ryan Brady arrived, dressed in civilian clothes as required by his service agreement. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, a stark contrast to the unkempt appearance he'd presented to Chief Reynolds days earlier. The center's director met him at the door, with a brisk handshake and minimal pleasantries, before leading him to the front desk. You'll work here 4 hours each day, Phillips explained, pointing to the computer and filing system. Greeting visitors, answering phones, helping with basic paperwork. Nothing complicated, but essential work. Brady nodded, trying to appear attentive while his eyes scanned the room for Colonel Wilson. He'd rehearsed what to say when they inevitably came face to face, but so far there was no sign of the older man. Colonel Wilson usually arrives around 9, Phillips said, as if reading his thoughts. He runs the Benefits Assistance Program on Tuesdays. Brady glanced at the clock. 8:30 a.m. He had 30 minutes to prepare himself. One more thing, Phillips added, his voice dropping slightly. Most of the people who come through that door have served this country in ways you and I haven't. Some bear visible wounds. Others carry invisible ones. All deserve respect. Yes, sir, Brady replied, the military address coming automatically in this environment. Phillips left him at the desk with an orientation binder, and Brady spent the next 20 minutes reading procedures and protocols with increasing nervousness. At precisely 9 o'clock, the front door opened and Colonel James Wilson walked in. Brady stood automatically, his heart hammering. Wilson moved toward the desk with the measured pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be. He was dressed simply, khaki pants, blue button-down shirt, no outward signs of his military rank or accomplishments. Officer Brady, Wilson said, stopping at the desk. Colonel Wilson, Brady replied, his mouth suddenly dry. The carefully rehearsed apology stuck in his throat. Wilson studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he simply said, The coffee machine in the break room is terrible, but it's better than nothing. Would you like a cup? The unexpected normality of the question threw Brady completely off balance. Yes, thank you. Wilson nodded and continued toward the break room, leaving Brady standing bewildered. No anger, no lecture, not even an acknowledgement of their previous encounter. Just a simple offer of coffee. Brady sat back down, trying to process what had just happened. He'd braced himself for coldness, for righteous anger, for a painful reckoning. Instead, he'd been offered coffee like any other colleague. A few minutes later, Wilson returned with 2 mugs. He set one on the desk in front of Brady. 200 hours is a long time, Wilson said matter-of-factly. I suggest you use them well. With that, he moved toward his office, stopping to greet other volunteers with the easy familiarity of long association. Brady took a sip of the coffee. It was indeed terrible, but the gesture behind it was something he couldn't yet define. He watched Wilson interacting with the veterans who came seeking help, noting the respect with which the older man treated each person. By the end of his first 4 hours, Brady had answered phones, directed visitors, and filed paperwork. Ordinary tasks, but performed in an environment that challenged everything he thought he knew about veterans, about black men of Wilson's generation, about service and dignity and respect. As he prepared to leave, Wilson approached the desk again. Same time tomorrow, Officer Brady? Brady nodded. Yes, sir. I'll be here. Good, Wilson said simply, then added, my father had a saying. The true measure of a person isn't in how they act when everyone's watching, but in who they decide to become afterward. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Brady with much to consider as he began the long journey of redefining himself, not just as an officer, but as a human being capable of growth and change. 6 months had passed since Officer Ryan Brady began his community service at the Veterans Center. The summer heat had given way to autumn crispness, and the trees lining the center's parking lot blazed with red and gold. Brady pulled into his usual spot, no longer feeling the nod of dread that had accompanied his first weeks of service. Inside, the center hummed with its morning routine. Veterans of various ages gathered in small groups, some seeking assistance with benefits, others simply there for the companionship of those who understood their experiences. Brady nodded greetings as he made his way to the desk where he had spent hundreds of hours over the past months. Today was different, though. Today marked the completion of his mandated service and the end of his probationary period with the police department. Tomorrow he would return to active duty, his future once again before him. Brady set his coffee mug, a gift from the center staff, on the desk and booted up the computer. As the system loaded, his gaze drifted to the wall of photos behind the reception area. Among them was a black and white image of a much younger James Wilson in his Air Force uniform, standing beside an aircraft with his flight crew. Brady had studied that photo often during quiet moments, trying to reconcile it with the elderly man he had so carelessly demeaned during that traffic stop. Last day, said a familiar voice. Brady turned to find Colonel Wilson approaching, moving a bit more stiffly than usual. The change of seasons always aggravated his arthritis. Yes, sir, Brady replied. 200 hours complete as of today. Wilson settled into the chair beside the desk, a position that had become familiar during their many conversations over the months. And how would you rate those hours, Officer Brady? On a scale of punishment to opportunity? It was the kind of thoughtful question Wilson often posed, never accusatory, always prompting reflection. Brady had come to appreciate these moments, though they had been uncomfortable at first. When I started, definitely punishment, Brady admitted. Now. He glanced around the center at the veterans he had come to know by name, whose stories he had heard, whose struggles and triumphs he had witnessed. Now I'd call it one of the most valuable experiences of my life. Wilson nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. Chief Reynolds tells me you'll be back on patrol tomorrow. Yes, sir. Second shift, West Side District. Different area than before, Wilson observed. Brady nodded. My request. Fresh start. A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind that no longer needed to be filled with nervous chatter. Brady had learned that Wilson valued these quiet moments of reflection, and over time he had come to value them too. I've been thinking about our first meeting, Brady said finally. Not here. The traffic stop. He still found it difficult to reference directly. I've wanted to ask, why did you advocate for me? After what I did, what I said to you, you could have pushed for my termination. Most people would have. Wilson considered the question, his gaze thoughtful. When I looked at you, I saw 2 possibilities. A young man who would be fired, become bitter, and carry his prejudices to another job, perhaps another department. Or a young officer who might, if given the right opportunity, confront those prejudices and grow beyond them. He shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly, I've lived long enough to see that punishment without purpose rarely changes anything. But accountability paired with opportunity, that can transform a person. Brady thought about his transformation over the past months, working alongside veterans, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, young, old, had challenged his preconceptions in ways no sensitivity training ever could. These weren't abstract concepts anymore, but real people with names and stories and lives as complex as his own. I was wrong about a lot of things, Brady said quietly. And not just that night, but in how I viewed the world, how I approached my job. And now? Wilson prompted. Now I understand that being a good officer means serving the entire community, not just the parts I'm comfortable with. It means checking my assumptions, listening more than talking. Brady met the older man's eyes directly. It means being the kind of officer I should have been from the start. Wilson nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Good. Remember that tomorrow and all the days that follow. The morning passed quickly with the usual flow of veterans seeking assistance. Brady found himself working with an efficiency born of months of practice, helping people navigate paperwork, answering questions, connecting them with the right resources. Work that had once seemed beneath him now felt meaningful, important. At noon, the center's director, Alan Phillips, emerged from his office with an unexpected announcement. Everyone, if I could have your attention for a moment. As you know, today is Officer Brady's last day of service with us. The staff has arranged a small lunch to mark the occasion. Brady felt heat rise in his face as applause broke out among the veterans and volunteers. He hadn't expected any acknowledgement, let alone celebration. The familiar shame of how he had come to be here threatened to surface, but he pushed it aside. That was part of his story now, but it wasn't the whole story. The break room had been decorated with a simple, "Thank you for your service" banner, the kind usually reserved for veterans, the irony of which wasn't lost on Brady. A sheet cake sat on the table alongside sandwich platters and soft drinks. As people filed in, Brady found himself surrounded by the same veterans he had helped over the months. They clapped him on the shoulder, shook his hand, wished him well. Their genuine warmth brought a tightness to his throat. Wilson arrived last, accompanied by a woman Brady recognized as his wife, Patricia. They had met several times when she dropped by the center. Though she had always maintained a polite distance, her initial wariness of him understandable. Phillips raised a paper cup of soda. To Officer Brady, you came to us under unusual circumstances, but you're leaving as part of our community. We wish you well as you return to your duties, and we hope you'll remember us out there. Hear, hear, came the chorus of voices. Brady cleared his throat, searching for the right words. I came here thinking I was serving a sentence, he said finally. But what I found instead was a lesson in service. I want to thank all of you for that, especially you, Colonel Wilson. He looked directly at the older man. You had every reason to want me punished, but instead you gave me a chance to learn. I won't forget that. Wilson raised his cup in quiet acknowledgement. As the gathering continued, Brady found himself alongside Patricia Wilson, who had been observing him thoughtfully. My husband believes people can change if given the right opportunity, she said without preamble. I wasn't so sure, especially in your case. Brady nodded, appreciating her honesty. And now? Now I think he might have been right. She smiled slightly. Just don't prove me wrong. Officer Brady. I won't, ma'am, he promised, meaning it more than any promise he'd ever made. The following evening, Officer Ryan Brady sat in his patrol car, scanning the streets of his new district. His polished badge caught the glow of streetlights as he adjusted his body camera, ensuring it was functioning properly, a habit he now considered essential. The radio crackled with a call, possible disturbance at a convenience store 6 blocks away. Dispatch, this is Officer Brady. I'm responding to that call. As he pulled into the store's parking lot, Brady saw 2 young men arguing near the entrance. One was white, around 20, wearing a college sweatshirt. The other was black, a bit older, dressed in work clothes. 6 months ago, Brady would have made immediate assumptions about this scene. Today, he approached differently. Body camera on, mind open. Good evening, gentlemen, he said, keeping his voice calm and neutral. I'm Officer Brady. Looks like you're having a disagreement.
Can you tell me what's going on?
The younger man spoke quickly. This guy tried to cut in line, and when I called him out, he got aggressive. Brady turned to the other man, giving him the same attentive gaze. Sir, your side of this? I wasn't cutting in line. I was already in line when I stepped out to grab something I forgot. When I came back to my spot, this guy started yelling at me. Brady nodded, listening to both without judgment. Let's take a step back and talk this through. First, are either of you in a hurry for an emergency reason? Both men shook their heads. Okay, then we have time to sort this out respectfully. Brady's tone remained even, professional. Store have security cameras that would show the line. The conversation continued, the tension gradually easing as both men felt heard. Brady facilitated rather than dominated, conscious of treating both with equal respect. Eventually, a review of the security footage confirmed the black man's account, and the younger man offered a somewhat grudging apology. As Brady returned to his patrol car, he noticed an elderly couple watching from their parked car. The man gave him a small nod of approval. For a moment, Brady thought it might be Colonel Wilson, but it was simply another elderly citizen, one who had witnessed an officer doing his job with fairness and respect. Back in his car, Brady logged the incident in his report, being careful to document the facts without bias or assumption. As he finished, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Wilson. How's the first day back? Brady smiled slightly, appreciating the check-in. He typed a brief response. Good. Different. Better. The reply came quickly. That's all any of us can hope for. Brady set his phone aside and put his car in drive, continuing his patrol through neighborhoods that were new to him, but that he was determined to serve with the understanding he had gained. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of his reflection, the same face that had glared at James Wilson 6 months ago, but with eyes that now saw the world differently. The transformation wasn't complete and perhaps never would be. Prejudice and bias weren't overcome in a single moment of revelation, or even in 200 hours of service. They required constant vigilance, continuous self-examination. But as Officer Ryan Brady drove through the quiet evening streets, he carried with him the lessons of an elderly black veteran who had responded to humiliation with dignity, to contempt with wisdom, and who had, in doing so, changed the course of a young officer's life. Some battles are fought with weapons, others with patience, persistence, and the courage to believe people can be better than their worst moments. In that quieter kind of battle, Colonel James Wilson had won a victory that would ripple outward in ways neither man could fully measure. One interaction, one officer, one community at a time.